change control. This is a age-old debate that, as a matter of fact, we're even in my company now, we're still talking about this. We have one particular software development lifecycle where they would like to take the point where we introduce formal change control and move it later into the process. Of course, later, never earlier, but later into the process. And we're talking about the pros and cons of that right now, because there are some. There are costs associated with formal change control. Here are some of them. There's review and approval. That takes time, sometimes lots of time. It can really slow down a project. And it can really inhibit a project from being nimble at a time when it needs to be nimble. We all know that up front, when you're still kind of figuring things out, a project does need to be very nimble in terms of change. It needs to have some fluidity, some flexibility, to be able to update its requirements on a very quick cycle. So it's in the learning phase. It's like an infant, still learning how to do things. They change very quickly. So formal change control that early in the process is actually detrimental. Some of the other costs associated with formal change control include independence of review. That's where you have to get your quality assurance unit involved to make sure you have independence of review. And that involves another whole team, another whole organization. You have to work with them. They're now a stakeholder. You need to get their buy-in. You need to make sure that they're going to commit some resources, coordinate with them. There is expenses associated with that. Impact assessments. We've talked about them. They are not free. They take time to do, especially if you're going to do one correctly. If you're at the very beginning of a software project where you're just figuring out your requirements, you don't want to do an impact assessment of every little change because your requirements are changing so rapidly at that point. Oh, let's get rid of this whole chunk of requirements. Let's add this whole chunk. Let's change this so that we can have our colleagues in Japan use the system as well. We're going to have to, do some Japanese interface or something like that. That's the way it is in software. You're really making huge, significant changes at a rapid pace at the beginning of the project. You don't want to do an impact assessment for every one of those changes. Too expensive, doesn't make sense. And risk analysis. Again, it takes time to invest in a good risk analysis. And if you're doing that too soon in a project, you're doing yourself a disservice. So again, where's the good point? Where there's too soon and there's too late. Now let's look at those for a minute. The dangers of mistimed change control. If you do it too soon, you're imposing overhead at a time when the project requires agility. Change control comes with overhead. We know that. There are forms to fill out. There are processes to follow. There are reviews and approvals that need to be gotten. There is a point in a project where it needs to be agile, where it needs to be jumping around freely without change control. Acknowledge that. And say, okay, we're not going to impose change control until something happens, and we'll get to that in a moment. So you can needlessly consume valuable resources. None of us, I think, work in companies where resources are so abundant, we don't have to worry about wasting them. And it incurs all kinds of unnecessary costs in terms of time and other costs associated with validation. But on the other hand, there are some dangers of doing change control too late in a process. Formal baselines become compromised because you're not controlling changes to them. When you establish a formal baseline, a baseline being a starting point for something. For a document, it might be revision A, or version 1 of the document might be a baseline. For software, it might be revision 1.0 as a baseline. But once you establish a baseline, and you don't have formal change control in place, that baseline becomes compromised because the changes to it are not recorded, not controlled. All of a sudden, your baseline is not a baseline anymore. It's gone. You're trying to validate a moving target. How many here have had experience with that? That's very difficult. It's hard enough to validate a still target. One that's stationary, that can be hard. But a moving target, well, that's next to impossible. You know, all of a sudden you've done, 10% of your test scripts, and then they update the software in your test environment. And then you do another 10% of your test scripts, and they update the environment again. And that can lead to some of the warning letters we looked at yesterday in some of our opening presentations. In a word, chaos. If you don't have formal change control, if you have formal change control starting too late in your project, you will end up with a chaotic environment. So let's try to figure out together, when is that ideal point to install formal change control? Let's talk about, I think it's different depending on what you're changing, what you're trying to control. Let's talk about documentation first. So it's very typical, at least in my organization, that we're developing a draft of a document. We do not put it under formal change control. You know, as a bunch of people, maybe a team of 6 people, one person's the author, he writes the first draft, sends it around for review, gets some comments, maybe has a review meeting, does some major wholesale changes. We generally don't impose any sort of formal change control on that process because it's so fluid at that point, it doesn't make sense. However, as soon as we enter the document into a configuration management system and baseline it after its first review and approval cycle, then we put formal change control in process. So that's a big step for us, is actually putting the document into the document management system, putting it on a CR for its initial review and approval. Does anyone else handle things differently in their company? So that's for documentation. How about other validation artifacts? What I have found is that the introduction of formal change control is best done when it's contemporaneous with a life cycle milestone. During a validation life cycle, there are different milestones that you have along the way. There could be quality gates or phase gates that you need to go through in your life cycle. That's a milestone when you pass one of those. You might have a freeze on requirements. This is very common in software. Although we never actually completely freeze requirements. Some people talk about requirement slush, where it's sort of frozen, but it's moving around a little bit. But we still call the milestone of requirements freeze, simply for the sake of saying, you know, this is where we're putting a stake down in the sand, and we don't really anticipate a lot of requirements changes after this. They happen. Of course they happen. We learn things as we develop software. But that's really the place where we draw a baseline on the requirements. Likewise, design freeze and code freeze. Good places to establish baselines and then formal change control for all changes to items contained in that baseline. So all these milestones during the validation lifecycle are great processes, great places to introduce the change control process as you go along. You don't have to implement the formal change control fully for everything. You can phase it in during your life cycle. You can introduce formal change control for documentation earlier, which we tend to do, and for source code later, which we tend to do. Because it's a life cycle and certain things are developed in order. At the latest, full change control must be in effect at the start of formal validation testing. This is the trying to validate a moving target problem. You don't want to do that. You need full change control. You need to know what you are formally validating. You need to be able to identify it unambiguously. We are testing version A. Now this was interesting when I was working on a project involving a global finished goods labeling system. And there were a lot of different parts in this system. There were printers with firmware. There was a master labeling system that had a label design module and a label printing module. And they all had their own release numbers. We must have had a dozen configuration items all being tracked with individual configuration release numbers. So what we did was we made, again, a master list and said, global labeling system version 1.0 is comprised of the following things. And we listed each configuration ID along with its revision. and we kept that in a control document. So we knew when we said we were testing global labeling system version 1 exactly what that configuration was that we tested. You've got to be able to do that. And the only way you can do that is by having change control in place.